Good Shabbos. This week's Parsha is Parshat Devarim. We begin the book of Deuteronomy this week in our reading. And the Parsha is called Devarim because that's the first significant word. Ele hadvarim, these are the words. Asher diber Moshe, that Moses spoke. El kol Yisrael, to all Israel. Beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arava. And we read that this happened, Vahi ba'arba'im shana, it came to pass in the 40th year, and in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel, according unto all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. So this is the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year. How many years did the Israelite people wander through the wilderness? 40 years. This is the end of that 40th year. The people are about to go into the land. Of course, Moses won't. Moses goes up on a mountain, sees the land, and dies, but it does not go into the land. Why didn't the people go into the land? They were told ultimately that they were not going to go into the land. This generation was, they were complaining. This generation was not going to go in. This generation left Egypt. Perhaps they wanted to leave Egypt. They didn't act that way all the time. They left Egypt, they got into the wilderness, and then they just wanted to go back. They were constantly wanting to go back. Remember how good it was back then when we were enslaved. I once heard someone say, it's like people who, like you've been in a cage, you wanted to get out, you finally got out, and the only thing you wanted to do was go back. That resonates in the prison, by the way, that story. I can tell you from this week, that story resonates in the prison. So, in the end, one interpretation as to why for 40 years they're going to wander is so that that one generation dies away, and the next generation that leads the way into the land is the generation born into freedom, and they can lead the way into the land. But that leads to another problem. Those people who are now the leading generation, they haven't seen what happened. They don't remember Egypt. They don't remember coming out of Egypt. They don't remember being at Sinai. And Moses is challenging them. You're going to go into this new land. You're going to be in this new circumstance. I'm not going to be there with you. You got to remember the old ways in this new place, in this new circumstance. So we have to make sure the people know what's happened in the past. And so we read, Ele hadvarim, these are the words. He uses words. He uses words, and he starts telling the story. He's weaving story to teach the past experience. Something we do a lot, something Jewish tradition does a lot. The book of Deuteronomy is entirely built around basically telling stories. Ultimately, Deuteronomy is the story of Moses telling the story to the people one last time. Now, and we're going to be reading this story, telling this story, all the way, the next few months, all the way until after, all the way until Sukkot, actually, next few months. Right now, we're in the midst of telling and remembering another aspect of that story. The story not of entering into the land, but in many ways the story of leaving the land for a long time, or the stories. We're in the midst of the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks the 3 weeks leading up to the 9th of Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which is Tuesday, Monday night and Tuesday of this coming week. The 9th of Av is the anniversary of the destructions of both temples by the Babylonians in 586 BCE and by the Romans in 70 CE. The destructions of the temple were accompanied by death and destruction, were accompanied by physical exile. The people in 586 BCE were exiled to Babylon. The destruction by the Romans eventually leads to fewer and fewer Jews in the land of Israel and 2,000 years of exile. And also it's understood the destruction of the temple leads to spiritual exile. The sacrifices aren't there, for one thing, but aside from that, the temple represents a link between heaven and earth. There's an understanding that with the destruction of the temple, there is greater brokenness in the world. And these 3 weeks, starting with the fast of Tammuz, which happened a short while ago, which is the anniversary of the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and is also understood to be the anniversary of the golden calf, part of the brokenness of the world. The fast of Tammuz is 40 days after Shavuot. So if Moses goes up the mountain on Shavuot, 40 days later he comes down the first time, and we have the golden calf. The 9th of Av is about the brokenness of the world, all of the suffering of the world. Maybe it's not coincidental. It comes in August around Hiroshima, Nagasaki is just one thing. Doesn't always come in August. But all the brokenness and heartbreak. Of course, after the 9th of Av, we leave these 3 weeks. Well, before we get to leaving the 3 weeks, on Monday night, people will gather in synagogues, the closer ones in Harrisburg. People will gather and sit on the floor in darkened sanctuaries and chant the Book of Lamentations. It's a fast day. It's sometimes called the Black Fast, and Yom Kippur is the White Fast. Following the 9th of Av, we end up, however, into the time of consolation. The next 7 weeks, the Haftorah that's read is a time, our Haftorahs on each Shabbat, our Haftorahs of consolation. The theme begins to change, and we move into the high holidays eventually. And we continue to tell stories. There is an idea that out of destruction comes the seeds of redemption. There is this idea that the Messiah will be born on the 9th of Av. And there's a story that's told that I think of every time I come here. There's a story that says when the temple was destroyed, stones from the temple were scattered around the world, and wherever a stone landed, there a synagogue was built. I don't know if it's literally true that wherever a stone landed, there a synagogue was built, but certainly wherever a Jew landed, wherever Jews landed, their synagogues were built. And the synagogue is called a mikdash ma'at, a little mikdash, a mikdash. The Beit Mikdash was the temple. So a little mikdash, so that the synagogue's a little bit of a temple. That's one way that we connect In the absence of the temple, we connect through telling story. We also read and study the sacrifices instead of performing them. But I have a story which is a very textured story here. So much hardship and so much hope. And I want to share that story as the third of three parts of what I'm saying today, just so you know. I've been following for many years from afar this little community, this little Jewish community called Beit Simcha Praha. Beit Simcha, house of joy of Praha, Prague. Beit Simcha Praha. This congregation, non-Orthodox congregation in Prague. And perhaps the greatest connection our little congregation has to Prague is that one late member of our congregation, Ambrose Klein, lived there for a while. He was from Czechoslovakia. I don't know how many people here remember, but he always considered himself as not so knowledgeable Jewishly, but the general knowledge of the time, that time and place Jewishly, was such that his depth of knowledge was so much greater than most of us. So, yeah. But here is the story of how I got to know about Beit Simcha Praha, and an explanation ultimately why I'm telling you the story. In 1995, my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was born and raised in Vienna, wanted to go back to Europe. She, however, was legally blind, and she asked me and my parents to go with her. Okay, go to Europe with you. My grandmother put together this trip. Most of the trip was a guided tour. One day in Vienna, one day going to Budapest. One day in Budapest, one day going to Krakow. One day going to Warsaw via Auschwitz and Częstochowa. One day in Warsaw. One day in Berlin. She had some friends in Berlin. One day going from Berlin to Prague. But then a week in Prague. My grandmother rented an apartment and we stayed for a week. I didn't really understand why we were doing this. Along the way, we did see some family in Poland and some friends of my grandmother in Berlin. But why Prague? It certainly was the best of all those cities to spend a week in. It was the most beautiful of all of them. But my grandmother had very little connection to Prague. But then I realized that my grandmother had arranged through Whitman Tours, operated by Sylvia Whitman. We'll come back to this. She had arranged for us to go to Theresienstadt. And the reason we were going to Terezin, which was this Czech town built inside a walled Austrian fortress that the Nazis had then evacuated and turned the whole town into a camp. The reason we were going there was because Terezin was where my grandmother's parents had both died. I hadn't really put that together. Through Whitman Tours, we went to Terezin, and we visited this town and its museum that tells the story of the ghetto using documents that the Nazis wrote themselves. Because after the end of the war, the Nazis left, the residents of the town came back. And then before they did much about that, the communists came in. And for the next, there was paralysis again, social paralysis for the next 50 years. And when the communists left, there was a school in the town that the communists, the secret police had used. So they turned that into a museum. And they posted Nazi documents, copies of Nazi documents, to tell the story in the Nazis' own words. And they did that in other places around the town as well. And when we reached the crematoria, there was again a document posted on the wall, written by the Nazis, an example of a daily report that each day was sent up the chain of command, stating by name and number who had died and what had happened that day in the camp. And the document posted there happened to be from the day that my great-grandfather had died. So there was my grandmother's father's name in the document posted on the wall over the crematorium. It was like looking at a copy of his death certificate. And it was the only time I felt a little relief that my grandmother was blind and could not see it. But we did tell her it was there, and she did look at it, trying to see it. Back in Prague, which is a beautiful town, wasn't bombed much during the war, we again visited the Jewish quarter. The Jewish quarter is still pretty much intact. On the lowest part of ground, it was in like Shaipok. It's the part that flooded all the time. That's why it was the Jewish quarter. But the buildings are old. The Altneu Shul is there, the oldest existing synagogue in Europe. It's the Altneu Shul, the old new shul, because there's another new shul which was built after the Altneu Shul. I mean, this was the new shul until the new shul was built, and then this became the Altneu Shul. So the Altneu Shul is there, and when you enter the Altneu Shul, you actually have to go, the first thing that happens is you go down to enter, because synagogues were not allowed to be higher than the churches. So in order to create a sense of height, they would dig down and put the floor down low so the ceiling could seem high when it wasn't. So we were back in the Jewish quarter. I found a notice of a progressive Jewish congregation, Beit Simcha Praha. Most of the Jewish congregations, most of the Jewish presence, living Jewish presence in Prague was Orthodox. In fact, you went into the Altneu Shul, and I was able to go into the sanctuary and sit along on some of the seats along the walls and look up at that ceiling and imagine maybe the golem is hiding in the attic above that ceiling. But my mother had to go into the corridor in the back and look through windows of walls this thick. So we found this liberal announcement of this liberal synagogue, and we decided to go, not certain what it would be. It turned out that the congregation was directly connected to Whitman Tours that had just facilitated this incredibly poignant moment for us in Terezin. Sylvia, who had started Whitman Tours, partly because everything Jewish that she was seeing around her in 1995, people were talking about being in the past, and she wanted to highlight the present. But so Sylvia had also helped to start Beit Simcha Praha. Now, there was some sort of student delegation visiting them that night. We joined the congregation and the students for a dinner in a nearby restaurant. They asked me to recite Kiddush, which was an honor, so I did. And then there were so many students. The congregation was small. There were so many students. It was overwhelming. the local members kind of just withdrew and let the students be students, and they went back to their own little meeting space and began a service. Someone played the piano, and we sang songs, and then Sylvia told some stories about Jewish life in the Czech Republic, and then the gathering finished up. I was surprised. I was expecting us to recite the evening prayers, and I asked why we didn't do so, and they told me that nobody knew them. And at that point, I was really upset with myself. I could have taught them. I could have taught what the prayers mean and how to sing them, but I didn't want to impose myself upon them. Normally, I listen first and then start to speak. This time, I listened too much and did not speak enough. A couple years later, some members of Temple Beth Shalom here in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, went to Prague. It was Chuck and Connie Songer. I told them about Beit Simcha Praha and gave them a copy of the Reconstructionist Jewish Prayer Book to present to them. And Chuck and Connie did present the Siddur to them. And indeed, I was remembered as the rabbi who visited and didn't say very much. Even later, I noticed over the internet that Beit Simcha had affiliated with the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation, the Reconstructionist movement, but since then this affiliation just seems to have disappeared, but some reference to it is still on their website. And for years, I followed the congregation's on their listserv, I got these little notes, meeting at this restaurant, meeting at that restaurant. Most weeks I got that little notice, and I still get them. I remember my grandmother telling me that her father, who died in Terezin, was born in a place called Hermann-Miestets. Hermann-Miestets. I can only remember that because when I told Ambrose Klein, he said, that means Hermanville. And my more recent research, which I could tell you more about later, indicates to me that this now is called Hermanov-Miestets. And evidently the synagogue there has been reconstructed and is used as a performance center. According to the research I've been able to do, my family lived there for about 200 years, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Rabbi Joachim, was a rabbi there until 1791. So for about 200 years, there was no rabbi in the family that we know of. But there's no Jewish community there now in Hermann-Miestets. And if I ever wanted to visit them, I'd probably contact Sylvia Whitman. And then I wrote them, and I said, with all of that as background, I often wonder if Beit Simcha Praha and Temple Beth Shalom in Mechanicsburg would ever consider becoming sister communities. With the help of Zoom, the communities can actually interact with each other. The biggest obstacle would be language, because none of us here know Czech. From what I can tell, the size and practices of the congregation may be very similar. And in any case, I think they might be compatible. Both are smaller congregations situated near larger sets of congregations in the town. I believe actually the largest, maybe most active congregation in Prague, certainly one of the most active and one of the largest, is a conservative or other type of, not conservative so much, but a more traditional World Union for Progressive Judaism synagogue. The Reconstructionist movement is also connected to the World Union for Progressive Judaism. So we still have that connection. And I said, I think it's possible our two communities could benefit by learning more about who we are each and how we interact and how we build Jewish community. And that was June. And then 10 days ago, I got an email Dear Rabbi, I'm very sorry that I'm only responding now. It's not that we thought about the answer for so long, it's just that I forgot to send the message and it stayed in my drafts folder. Anyway, thank you for your email. We are glad that you have such memories of Prague in our community where Sylvia is still a member. It is true, Beit Simcha is more inclined to Reform Judaism than Reconstructionist, but every contact with a friendly community is welcome, and we are open to the proposal for cooperation. Your proposal pleased us, and it certainly makes sense to us. Olga Metzelchova, coordinator. So, that's about as far as I got with this, except to say that wherever a temple stone landed, there a synagogue was built. This story that I just told you has so many of the elements of Tisha B'Av and so many of the elements of the period of consolation that follows. And I would like to suggest that perhaps we start creating an ongoing relationship with this little congregation in this fascinating historical place of European and Jewish history in the Czech Republic, Prague. We can talk about it more downstairs. Shabbat Shalom.